Welcome to the final session of this conference. I'm very pleased and honored to be introducing Anita Chari, who is a political theorist, somatic educator, and vocalist based in Portland, Oregon, and is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oregon. Her scholarly work focuses on the significance of aesthetics and embodiment for critical theory. And practice, critical theory and practice. Her first monograph, A Political Economy of the Senses, was published in 2015 by Columbia University Press. It takes up the problem of reification from a materialist perspective, tracing its ramifications on a micro and macro level, crossing all social forms, to examine the implications of neoliberalism's transformation of the relationship between politics and economics, realized over and through sense. Recent publications include pieces in the following: The Hysterical Material, 2017, New Political Science, 2016, Theory and Event, 2015, and Philosophy and Social Criticism. I'm very delighted to be introducing her, and I would also like to acknowledge that we are convened today on unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples. So with that, thanks, Anita.
Great, thank you, Jaleh. I just want to first of all thank all of you for being here, and thanks Samir for inviting me, because it's actually so cool for me to see how I have all these interlocutors that I actually didn't realize I really had to meet. You know, I've been perusing through aesthetic Marx, and also I've kind of from afar been a fan of Jaleh, so it's really great to have this opportunity. So, are we going to leave this door open or what? Okay. Yeah. Cool, thanks, Samir. So the title of my talk is I Am Your Voice, Aesthetics, Politics, and the Materialization of Critique. And basically, this is kind of new work that I've been working on that that's very, early information. And basically, I'm exploring two recent exhibitions by the artist collective Clairefontaine. And, I feel like this talk begins kind of where Jaleh left off yesterday, as she went through a lot of the really important issues at stake in their work. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about a very recent work that they've done, two exhibitions. One of them called I Am Your Voice, that's the title of my talk, which showed in Plymouth, UK earlier this winter at a place called Karst. And The Crack Up is the other one, which showed at NBK in Berlin, both earlier in the winter. As a self-declared ready-made artist, Clairefontaine offers its work as a natural candidate for thinking through the affective, perceptual, and linguistic double binds of late capitalism. Over the past decade, their work is often operated by defamiliarizing the familiarity of everyday objects, signs, and significations, and in so doing, revealing the conditions of their production and consumption in surprising ways. Fontaine's work uses the form of the artwork as a means for propelling the artist as well as the viewer between the realms of theory and praxis, reality and fantasy, desire and ethics. A central preoccupation of their work, it seems to me, is the reflection of political stasis. And in this talk, I want to consider the critical labor performed by art that commits such reflection, and to think about the ways that it might deepen our understanding of the forms of critique that could be adequate to theorizing the political in the context of contemporary neoliberalism. I highlight the ways in which these two recent exhibitions of Clairefontaine speak to two different refractions of neoliberal domination. On the one hand, The Crack Up speaks to neoliberal processes of dissolution and the psychological and economic fragmentation of the neoliberal subject through presenting images of stasis, speechlessness, and visceral and affective fragmentation. This exhibition as a whole alludes perhaps to a negative space opened up by neoliberalism's violent processes of accumulation and financialization. On the other hand, I Am Your Voice speaks to the political logics of populism and fascism that arise in the space of that space of dissolution, with references to Trumpism and Brexit, as well as to the psychological and discursive conditions of possibilities for these events. I want to highlight the specific kind of critical labor in this talk that I see operating in Clairefontaine's work, building on the work that the theorist Sylvia Krostowska has done on the centrality of mirroring to the logic of revolution. I highlight the processes of mirroring that these works engage in, foregrounding a mimetic process that reflects back to society both movement and stasis. translating Krostovska's theorization of mirroring into a more affective and somatic frame, I suggest that in the context of apparent political stasis, of post-democracy in the terms of Jacques Rancière, the process of mirroring can be a working through of political shock that characterizes reified subjectivity in late neoliberalism. In this talk, I will do some thick description of these two recent exhibitions. I then draw out their theoretical stakes by thinking these artworks through the notion of mirroring as a form of critical disclosure, with references to Krostovska, to Adorno's work on aesthetic autonomy and reification, as well as to Hal Foster's work on mimetic exacerbation, that's his term, as an aesthetic strategy that has characterized what he sees as a conjuncture of emergency in neoliberalism. This work is part of a larger project of mine of developing what I have elsewhere called a political economy of the senses, a sensate, contactful elaboration of critique that synthesizes a Marxian critique of political economy with a radical democratic aesthetic politics through the lens of a critique of capitalist reification. While I won't go into depth about that whole theoretical problematic in this talk, I wanted to name that it is a backdrop to the work that I'm doing here, and I will talk a bit about reification as it relates to the artwork. So just to begin, this is an image from that exhibition, I Am Your Voice, of the room. So the central installation of I Am Your Voice is an empty, darkened room, empty except for 3 illuminated neon signs on the walls. As one enters the room, to one's back is a large red display with the words, I Am Your Voice. These are the words of Donald Trump's acceptance speech of the Republican nomination for his presidential candidacy. A fateful moment, no doubt. The red hue of the sign floods the dark space with an eerie, and I know that I'm projecting when I say it, almost demonic quality. That's how it feels in there. Of course, there is the allusion to the red of the Republican Party, but red has an overdetermined symbolic resonance, as Phil knows. Beneath this wan red light, there are whispers of other reds, of the red of blood and the red of communism. The words are displayed at one's back. They illuminate through obfuscation. These red words from Trump somehow seem to disclose and determine a certain universe of discourse. The light emitted from this sign is the background to everything else in the room. It is the space rather than the object within the space. As one advances further into this room, there are 2 more neon signs displayed across from one another. This is one of them. On the right wall, in circular illuminated text, that's not this one, but I don't have an image of it. There's another sign that reads, I want it, I don't get it, therefore I am bad. So it's a neon sign with that text on it. Or alternatively, because it's a flashing sign, so it goes one way and then the other, alternatively, the text reads, I want it, I get it, therefore I'm good. Depending, so it seems, on the luck of the draw, on the way that the machine flashes. There is an algorithmic unpredictability in the words displayed, which appear and disappear in rhythmic regularities and irregularities. The circular display of the words conveys a sense of a wheel of fortune of sorts, and the words themselves bespeak an obvious capitalist logic, equating moral goodness or lack with one's ability to get what one wants. And whether one gets what one wants or not, whether one is good or bad, appears to be a matter of chance, of an algorithm which one accedes to without perceiving or understanding it. Directly opposite the wheel of fortune, there is another serial display, displaying another linguistic knot. I do it because it's right because I do it. Both are phrases from the somewhat notorious anti-psychiatric psychologist R.D. Laing. The latter phrase appears in a collection of his works entitled Knots, which among other things includes numerous circular, quasi-poetic, logical puzzles. It is a curious strategy for Clairefontaine to highlight these knots in the context of Trump's sinister populism. These displays of text seem to point to the circularity of a manic logic and a moral disorientation that intensifies only more through its solipsism. These knots, as Laing calls them, reveal a bizarre but obvious affinity with neoliberal economic logics in this installation. I want it, I don't get it, therefore I am bad, speaks to the equation of moral goodness or badness with economic success or lack thereof. On the opposite wall, the statement is more about the moral legitimation of instinct and impulse. It's right because I do it because it's right. These sparse statements from Laing flash when they want to at machine tempo. They are apparently random in their rhythm, like the capitalist market. Seen in more intersubjective terms, they seem to follow an atomistic tempo. They flicker intermittently, yet not in response to their environment. The signs displayed on opposite walls really aren't in conversation, but they appear to be in one. Displaying these knots in a sculptural conversation alongside Trump's words, "I am your voice," seems to invoke and imitate a kind of hypnotic narcissism. One is trapped within these circular logics, though their more active rhythm offers a kind of distractive relief from the constant red of Trump's populist fascism encapsulated in the "I am your voice" sign. The use of neon to illuminate speech that bears an overdetermined function within contemporary society is a strategy that Clairefontaine has often used in her work, and we saw some of those images yesterday in Jaleh's talk. Neon seems to highlight the commodity aspect of speech while also allowing for a deeper contemplation of the status of linguistic fragments as axiomatic of the conscious and unconscious assumptions of capitalist society. As Clairefontaine writes, Our work looks for ways to carry and contain concepts. It plays with references, but you don't need to know or recognize them to fully understand it. You are a better judge of our work than we are. The work was made for you, not for us. In this exhibition, there's a staging of counterpoint between different and perhaps apparently competing thought forms. The white neon signs feel like a relief, but it's more ideology in the midst of the red. Such relief is actually false and only in relation to the Trumpian speech, which is the background, the undertone, the horizon. If "I Am Your Voice" explores the sculpturalization of contemporary political speech and the narcissism of its prosody, the second exhibition I'll discuss, The Crack-Up, is more about the negative space that emerges from the destructive processes of neoliberal accumulation and a sense of stasis and disorientation that emerges in their wake. So I think this is the first image from that. The title of the exhibition is named after an essay of the same title by F. Scott Fitzgerald, called The Crack-Up, in which he writes about his experience of a mental breakdown. And so this is a quote from Fitzgerald. "Before I go on with this short history, let me make a general observation. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise." So I think this statement encapsulates a particular affect of political hope, perhaps in the sense of the earlier talk from today, that Fontaine draws upon. Hope in the Blockian sense that goes beyond the quotidian forms of cruel optimism that allow us to simply function within the conditions, sometimes excruciating and sometimes merely numbing, of contemporary neoliberal society. But this is a hope that emerges only through a steely embrace of absolute stasis, of the impotence that structures subjectivity and agency in the contemporary moment. Or so I think this exhibition would have us see it that way. So the exhibition juxtaposes three works. The Assistants is this one here. This is just a film still of it. It's a video. And it was earlier shown in 2011, so it wasn't newly shown here, but it was newly juxtaposed here. The Assistants is a video of an artist's assistant, or so they call this person an artist's assistant. In reality, he's a poet who is hired to read a text. And he's reading a text by Giorgio Agamben of the same name out loud, or rather trying to. The collective subject, Clairefontaine, comprised of Fulvia Carnevale and James Thornhill, refers to themselves as an artist assistant, a commentary on the status of artistic labor and an act of desublimating the artistic process and equating its labor with the supposedly mere manual labor of the assistant. In this film, the assistant stutters with inchoate sounds and gestures. His gaze wanders, and the text he reads is incomprehensible, reduced and deconstructed to apparently proto-linguistic sounds. Perhaps we are meant to feel the ways in which this assistant is shattered by his labor. Fractured by his precarity, unable to make statements or propositions, he is reduced to jagged gestures which have no goal or legibility. It is in this lack of legibility, in the disoriented impasse of labor that can no longer even define itself in relation to exploitation, that we feel both the economic mania of neoliberalism and the potency of labor's reduction to bare life. We see in the assistant perhaps a socially and economically induced hysteria that could be the precondition for a radically different relation to body, subjectivity, and labor. In Fontaine's words, everything that now appears debased and worthless to us is the currency that we will have to redeem on the last day. The assistants translate and deliver a message of freedom without understanding it. They are foreigners, inadequate, idle, but they are the only ones that can save us. So I think that statement encapsulates something about that problematic, even though it's a little bit gestural. The assistance is installed along with two other works, Cracked and another untitled work. So this is Cracked. Cracked, as you can see, is a photograph of a saltine cracker sealed in a shiny, transparent plastic packaging. And the cracker inside, as you can see, is shattered, cracked into hundreds of pieces. And you can't really see the details on this thing, and it's kind of funny to even try to look at the details on this thing, but tiny drops of humidity cling to the plastic film, showing that the cracker's not only cracked, but falling apart, imploding, yet still held together by its prophylactic skin. Like an inert, embalmed body, the cracker is the frozen representation of decay, of decomposition. Yet everything still hangs together somehow. The plastic preserves the image of form amid debilitating fissures. It is an apparently banal image displayed on a plastic backlit board that makes it look like an ad of some kind, alluding, I think, to the way that contemporary discourse, even when it seeks to be critical or political speech, is legible only through a logic of commodification, of branding, the scaffolding that holds the frail and tearing fabric of society together. As with much of Clairefontaine's work, often comprised of variations on the ready-made, this piece is so simple and sparse that it invites and demands projection. It is, in some sense, I think, a sculpturalization of thought itself, a reified reflection through which we can somehow see ourselves, the thoughts and commitments we are bound, however reluctantly, to live by, encapsulated in objective form. One of those inevitable projections, it strikes me, in the case of this one, is a racial economic allusion to the wounded working class subject of the Trump era, the fracturing of white subjectivity, to the hysterical revolt of the cracker in 2016. Thinned and hollow out by its own false universality, with nothing left to hold its structure, whiteness dissolves into filaments of crumbs. A cracker is devoid of nourishment, a white wafer that seems like it could live on infinitely, wrapped in a film, waiting to be eaten, waiting to be used, spent. But even when devoured, it gives no energy. It yields only a momentary surplus. It stands in for a potential that is infinitely deferred, and that was never really potential after all. What better image for the false promises of capital and the cruelty of its optimism than the hermetic saltine? Pure surface, shiny, plastic, protected from use, from movement, and from contact. The eyes cannot pierce its membrane. It is, again, a reflection of stasis. The reflection of stasis and of the absent, fragmented, precarious, and ambivalent subject of neoliberalism is a central preoccupation of Clairefontaine's work overall, in these shows for sure, but I think of their earlier work, it's a constant theme. The third work in this exhibition is another backlit photograph of a set of shiny, colorful marbles contained within a glass jar. I don't have a great image of this one, but it's there to the right, and then I think, yeah. So, as you can see with these marbles, the marbles do not and cannot move. It is again an image of containment, and the inevitable illusion of marbles, not to get too linguistic about it, is to the mind and the possibility of losing it. The marbles are gathered, but they could just as easily be scattered. Perhaps it would be better if they could be scattered. The effect of this sparse arrangement of works, so it seems, is to point out that the containment of societal mania itself takes energy, and that this itself is more crazy-making than accepting dispersion, more insane than simply losing it. These shiny marbles are not comforting in their containment. They are somewhat ominous, and the body of the stuttering assistant displayed across the room seems to bear the affective toll of the precarious holding together of things that are just about to fall apart. In the Fitzgerald essay that inspired the exhibition title, Fitzgerald recounts a conversation that I think is interesting on this point about what they're trying to do here. This part of the essay recounts a conversation that Fitzgerald had with a friend about his crack-up, his mental breakdown, which he called a crack-up. The friend said to him, "Instead of being so sorry for yourself, listen, suppose this wasn't a crack in you. Suppose it was a crack in the Grand Canyon." "The crack's in me," that's what Fitzgerald said in reply. The friend responded, "Listen, the world only exists in your eyes, your conception of it. You can make it as big or as small as you want to. And you're trying to be a little puny individual. By God, if I ever cracked, I'd try to make the world crack with me. Listen, the world only exists through your apprehension of it. And so it's much better to say that it's not you that's cracked, it's the Grand Canyon." Here we can see the staging of a certain necessity of the crack-up. Subjectivity must crack up, and there is no heroism in it. But there are important questions to be asked about whether this crack-up is collective or individual, and how the neoliberal subject relates to the responsibilization of his or her own fragmentation. As Claire Fontaine notes in an interview from 2016, the feeling of political impotency is as much personal as immediately collective, because it is precisely the poignant awareness of the lack of connection with others that could make life significant and powerful. It isn't an individual problem, or it is individual because it is collective, and vice versa. So as I've tried to work through my ongoing theoretical interest in Claire Fontaine's work and the significance of its critical gestures, I realized that an essential aspect of my own thinking about it continued to be informed by the way that their work embodies aspects of a critique of capitalist reification, which is how I've written about them before. Specifically, I find Theodor Adorno's theorization of reification and artistic autonomy to be useful for understanding Claire Fontaine's work and to disclosing a critique of reification that has a sensate, affective, and perceptual orientation. So here I want to gloss Adorno's discussion of artistic autonomy and reification because I think it helps to illuminate a few points. First, the significance of the way Claire Fontaine's ready-mades and word and image objects are playing with issues of artistic autonomy and critique. Secondly, the critical significance of mimicking the commodity form, mimicking reification in order to critique it. And thirdly, the way their work helps us to move beyond an Adornian formulation of the reification of the artwork to develop a critique of neoliberalism that is focused on the sensate and affective dimensions of contemporary neoliberal society. I mean, I think it's implied by Adorno, but then needs to go beyond. So just to go into that, edifice of Adorno's in terms of the autonomous artwork, because it needs some elaboration because this form of autonomy is a paradoxical and highly mediated kind of autonomy that Adorno describes. In aesthetic theory, Adorno conveys this paradox through a dynamic and restless dialectical mode of presentation. In that work, art and society stand in chiasmatic relation to one another. Art is both part of society as a totality, as well as its negation. Artworks, therefore, occupy a precarious and contradictory position within society. They are defetishizing fetishes. The idea of the artwork as a defetishizing fetish begins to get at Adorno's complex notion of aesthetic reification. To say that artworks are fetishes is to acknowledge that they are produced in a society in which commodity production and exchange is the dominant form of social mediation. Even supposedly autonomous artworks fall within the sphere of the social totality of commodity exchange, of course. They are fetishes in the same sense that other kinds of commodities are fetishes. They obscure the labor that went into producing them and appear to be objects that satisfy a particular kind of need exchanged in accordance with the abstract medium of exchange value. But the specific fetishism of the artwork as a commodity is its appearance as a special, unique kind of cultural object that is autonomous from its economic and social conditions of production. Its very autonomy is a fetish. Furthermore, the artwork is fetishized in its lack of functionality. It apparently serves no social use beyond its mere existence. And yet the artwork nevertheless can contain de-reifying aspects, according to Adorno. In a society where the logic of exchange predominates, the artwork's semblance of autonomy constitutes resistance to exchange. By appearing to exist for itself, as it were, the artwork combats the reduction of all objects in capitalism to their economic functionality. The semblance of autonomy from socioeconomic conditions allows the artwork to put forth alternatives that are not compromised by social reification. Finally, the very uselessness of the art object forges a short circuit in the hegemony of instrumental rationality. Adorno refers to artworks as absolute commodities, which I think is really interesting, pure exchange values that thereby explode the logic of exchange. So here's a quote from Adorno. It's not as long as Samir's awesomely long quotes, but so if artworks are in fact absolute commodities in that they are a social product that has rejected every semblance of existing for society, a semblance to which the commodities otherwise urgently cling, the determining relation of production, the commodity form, enters the artwork equally with the social force of production and the antagonism between the two. here's the important part, the absolute commodity would be free of the ideology inherent in the commodity form, which pretends to exist for another, whereas ironically it is something merely for itself. Adorno's idea of artistic autonomy is intimately bound to his understanding of reification in the aesthetic sphere. While never systematically articulated, the category of reification forms the frame of Adorno's aesthetic theory, though the way he formulates it in this work is very different from its formulation, for example, in Dialectic of Enlightenment, where reification refers to the inertia of the subject-object dialectic, in which subjective involvement in the economic process becomes eliminated. By contrast, aesthetic theory almost reverses this formulation. The reification of the artwork is valorized by Adorno here in aesthetic theory to some degree. Reification of the artwork somehow contains the potentiality for a radical subtraction from the social order. It is clear that Adorno's usage of reification in this work, aesthetic theory, moves away from his more Lucasian usage of the category in other works. Here, perhaps heeding his own warning that the critique of reification can itself become reified when it becomes a critique of objectivity altogether. Adorno problematizes the thing, the Ding, in Verdinglichung, reification, which, like the commodity, is full of metaphysical subtleties of its own. The classical formulation of the critique of commodity fetishism, stemming from Marx's original formulation in Volume 1 of Capital, is that fetishism involves the mystification of relations between humans, which come to appear as an abstract, objective relationship between things, commodities and forms of capital. But furthermore, commodity fetishism refers to an abstraction that takes place within the material things themselves. What appear to be material objects, use values that are for the satisfaction of human needs, are abstractions, exchange values, that recast the material itself in terms of its own investment in the ceaseless cycle of commodities, money, commodities, in the pursuit of accumulation. What this means is that a critique of objectivity as such, which Adorno accused Lukács famously of conducting, fails to get at the specific pathology of reification, since reification actually entails an abstraction of objects in the real itself, and I think that's the important point. Reification in this sense concerns the production of objects, commodities, that somehow are not reducible to their material aspect, yet present themselves as objective, thingly, and naturalized. So when Adorno speaks of the reification of artworks as something constitutive of their potential for some kind of social critique, it seems that he is attributing the powers of resistance, at least in part, to their thingly character. And this is what I'm interested in developing more, which is this idea of that it is the thingly character, it's really the mimicking of the thingly character of the artwork that I'm interested, not the thingly character as such. It's the thingly character of the artwork, its mimicking of the commodity form that somehow permits the work to critique its social immanence. So I next want to describe this way of talking about reification through the lens of a logic of mimesis, or to use a more embodied way of talking about it, a logic of mirroring. And that's what I'm going to turn to this theorist and writer, Sylvia Krostowska, and her writing about mirroring to do. So in a recent article on film and revolution, the writer and theorist Sylvia Krostowska examines the role that art plays in revolutionary situations. And she makes the argument that revolutionary political events and moments demand reflection rather than representation. While there is much to suggest that film in particular assists emancipatory movements by representing them, in her words, quote, by making discontent visible and its manifestation resonant or contagious, Krostowska pushes against this representational focus, arguing that the revolutionary effect of aesthetic political reflection is a complexification of revolution as event through the complication of representation. This is still her. And she says, how do you represent an indeterminate, unforeseeable collective action? How do you capture this without, on the one hand, surrendering your image to actuality and contingency, which could only come through as aimlessness, disunity, or dysfunction, or on the other hand, ridding the image of these same qualities? So that's her, Krostowska's caveat. Emphasizing the ways in which revolutionary moments disrupt an existing order of representation, she argues that while representation is on the side of ideology, even revolutionary ideology, reflection is actually on the side of struggle. So I see her argument in many ways sharing a lot of affinity with Jacques Ranciere's notion of the political as a rupture in an existing order of the division of the sensible, one that occurs through a processual articulation of speech or subjectivity that could only be experienced as noise within an existing political order. What I want to highlight in Krostowska's argument is her emphasis on the process character of such revolutionary moments and the importance of aesthetic artistic practices that are adequate to these moments of rupture and dissensus. And I think that Krostowska highlights a way of understanding the critical and disclosive functions of art in relation to politics that emphasizes reflection as critique. And this is from her. I think I have this quote here. Reflection works through the circulation of politicized vision among those engaged, who follow its course from moment to moment, from one face, transfigured by it, to the next, from a gesture in one body to its mirroring and continuation in another, animated momentarily by the energies of struggle, without ever illuminating the totality, without guaranteeing revolutionary enlightenment. What interests me about thinking about how art can serve revolution through reflection is that it shifts us from a way of understanding art's function primarily in terms of its signification to the principle of resonance. And quoting her again, the suspicion of representative images in transformative politics may have something to do with the move from a symbol theory of revolution to one based on resonance. So it may appear upon first glance bizarre to speak about resonance in relation, going back to Clairefontaine's work. Their practice is largely conceptual and neo-Dadaist, often making use of the ready-made as a principal medium and strategy. Unlike the filmic representations that Krostowska is describing in her works, with their emphasis on movement and process, Clairefontaine's work is apparently obsessed with stasis. Clairefontaine's use of ready-mades emphasizes reification rather than movement and focuses on the crystallizations of thought, capital, and agency rather than on their dynamism or vibration. But here is where I would adapt Krostowska's claims about the significance of mirroring in two ways. First, I want to suggest that the mirroring of stasis is as relevant as the mirroring of movement to the political. And secondly, that focusing on mirroring as a principle helps us to grasp critique as a form of contact. Krostowska highlights that mirroring amplifies resonance in the context of a revolutionary event by resisting the form-giving tendencies of representative practice. If we think about mirroring as a particular kind of contact, which is how I think of it, we can see that it is actually a condition for creating resonance and entrainment between bodies, between subjectivities. Through the mimetic process of reflection, a resonant field of communication could be created that informs the social nervous system and opens up new possibilities and avenues for action. In the words of the Invisible Committee, revolutionary movements do not spread by contamination, but by resonance. And I think people understand, and it's often discussed, the centrality of resonance to moments of political rupture, but I actually am trying to highlight how fundamental it is to igniting moments of dissensus in a condition of political stasis, really. While this seems to be the case, what I just read from the Invisible Committee, while it seems to be the case that resonance is so important in heightened revolutionary situations, I want to suggest that mirroring is also crucial in conjunctures of apparent political stasis, and that mirroring is central to the logic of the political itself. Mirroring is a strategy by which critique can amplify its ability to disclose alternative political realities. As the political theorist Roman Coles writes in his book Visionary Pragmatism, he has an extended discussion of mirroring and resonance in a chapter in that book. He writes, if human resonance harbors highly dynamic receptive potentials to otherness, and futurity, then illuminating these might aid our political imaginations of radical democratic practices that in turn cultivate receptive learning and thus intensify the opening or emergent character of political time. They might develop a more potent relation to presently unactualized possibility, the not yet, which is so integral to human freedom and flourishing. This emphasis on mirroring, which motivates resonance, points to a different understanding of the labor of critique and of critical art than that of representation, surely. I believe that the notion of mirroring helps us to understand Clairefontaine's artistic practice as a materialization of critique itself. The notion of mirroring provides an embodied, contactful lens for understanding their particular brand of neo-Dadaist conceptual critique. And I want to develop that a little bit by looking at what a discussion in Hal Foster's book, Bad New Days, Art Criticism and Emergency. In that book, he explores a set of predicaments in the current socio-political conjuncture to which contemporary art strategically responds. While he explores several paradigms in that book, I'm interested in discussing one in particular, which is his exploration of mimesis in contemporary art. Foster explores a number of contemporary artists who adopt this particular strategy of exaggerated mimesis. That's what he's especially interested in, what he calls mimetic exacerbation. And he locates the source of this paradigm in the early 20th century Zurich Dadaists who, quote, took the corrupt language of the European powers around them and played it back as caustic nonsense in a mimetic adaptation to the traumatic conditions around them. For the Dadaists, as well as for the early Frankfurt School, especially Benjamin and Adorno, mimetic exacerbation was in many ways a survival strategy, a defense. At least that's Foster's interpretation of it, as defense. As Hugo Ball wrote in 1917, the farce of these times reflected in our nerves has reached a degree of infantilism and godlessness that cannot be expressed in words. Foster argues that this Dadaist strategy of mimetic exacerbation has a particular affinity to times of emergency, and as it arose in the early 20th century, it has again become pervasive in the past few decades. I suggest that we could conceive of this idea of mimetic exacerbation or paradigm or gesture in a more effective and somatic register, as again, as I've been trying to say up till now, as a form of mirroring. And though I think that it makes sense that this would become a pervasive strategy in times of what Hal Foster calls emergency, I would not read this strategy primarily as defense or adaptation, but as a strategy of political disclosure, through which reified consciousness mirrors back to itself, its shock. If we take Hugo Ball's somatic language literally, with its references to the nerves and the psychic toll of late modernity, which I do, we could understand mirroring as an aspect of the way in which something like a societal nervous system becomes ignited out of its dissociation. The reflection of freeze, of impotence, of dissociation is the condition of possibility for it to become something else. Reading the critical labor of Clairefontaine's artistic work in this somatic affective register is part of a project that I have referred to, and I referred to in the beginning as a political economy of the senses. And though I don't have time to go into the whole argument here, the general idea of this involves a synthesis of Marxist critique of political economy on the one hand, and an aesthetic theory of radical democracy in the spirit of Jacques Rancière's work on the other hand, and argues that such synthesis is crucial for grasping the specific forms of domination that neoliberalism presents. With the notion of a political economy of the senses, I propose a form of critique that joins an analysis of abstract dynamics of political economy and capitalist accumulation with an understanding of the experiential, sensate, and aesthetic dimensions of neoliberal society. As such a critique would inhabit the relationship between economics, aesthetics, and subjectivity, and seek to understand critique not only in terms of cognitive modes of the critique of neoliberalism, but perhaps more fundamentally through forms of critique that touch on the affective, embodied, and sensate dimensions of political experience. Moreover, a political economy of the senses understands political practices and art objects as themselves performative of theory, and in this sense entails methodologically what I call the materialization of critique. I understand this as a shift from a form of theory that is merely cognitive to a form of theory that is understood as embodied in material objects, artworks, practices, and events themselves, and seeing these events and practices as themselves performative of theoretical visions. So the main point I want to make here is that I believe that the labor these artworks perform is a labor of critique through materialization. There's the translation of contemporary forms of subjectivity into material form and the mirroring back to the subject, its shock, its stasis, its ambivalence. These works hold up to our eyes the crystallized images of mania that have become quotidian until reflected back to us. And so I think Clairefontaine's work achieves this critical effect of mirroring often by projecting a fetishized image of its own autonomy. We often see in their work ready-mades, objects, and words abstracted from their context, and installations that construct apparently autonomous and sometimes sinister worlds. Their work invokes important issues regarding these questions of aesthetic autonomy and heteronomy, and the significance of these polar critical gestures in contemporary art theory and practice. If, as Walter Benjamin claims, criticism is a matter of correct distancing, the correctness of the proximity of the critic also bears on the question of autonomy and heteronomy in art. And to put it very simply, the extent to which the critic sees their task as one of abstraction from society or of immersion in it. The tension between aesthetic autonomy and heteronomy is always undecidable, and each strategy, I believe, presupposes the other on a continuum of mediation between art and society. Thinking again with Adorno, circa aesthetic theory, the critical artwork is always dynamically undermining both its autonomy and its heteronomy. Its autonomy allows the artwork to function as a fetish, which critically calls into question the very fetish character of the commodity form. On this continuum, relational aesthetics, which is this thing that people talk about in art theory, I believe along the lines of people like Nicolas Bourriaud. And I think Jaleh has an awesome anthology that explores some of these problems that I highly recommend. So relational aesthetics, for example, might locate the critical impact of art practice in the foregrounding of its heteronomy, embedding art in the context of communities, social practices, and economic relationships, and decentering it from the abstraction of a museum context. Yet here we can see that relational aesthetics creates a clear problem of obscuring art's relationality as a fetish. By embedding art in social contexts, often setting up sites of community or performing community and social service functions that are neglected or underserved in particular communities. Art as social practice seems to somehow aspire towards compensating for neoliberal precarity. And perhaps in that compensation, through specific socially directed artistic strategies, disclose angles of critique and political struggle that were not previously visible. But in the worst case scenario, art as social practice actually obscures forms of domination through setting up heteronymous and instrumental social sites to stage an artistic statement. And I think yesterday, Jaleh's talk was really an excellent, demonstration of that problem as it surfaces. And I think Thomas Hirschhorn, I think you mentioned yesterday, is a perfect example of what would be problematic in this kind of way of approaching social art as social practice. But it is for this reason that I would suggest that Clairefontaine's work is deliberately anti-relational. Their anti-relationality is society's anti-relationality. Their work is a broken mirror. Its very brokenness is society's fissure. Both the reflection and the cracks together deliver a vision of the fragmented totality. So I'll just end there. Thanks. Thank you.
I have so many questions and comments. I loved the phrase atomistic tempo, and that's yours.
That's me.
Right?
Yeah.
That's very nice.
Thanks.
If I had the luxuriance of a lot of time, I'd want you to elaborate a little bit on that, because that one phrase seems to capture and emblematize a lot of what we think we mean with the word neoliberalism, but you have to elaborate that. Couple of things I'll throw out there. I'm really delighted by your exegesis of the crackers. I wasn't aware that pejorative term was a well-known pejorative term, even
Maybe
in the
it's
Pacific
not,
Northwest. I thought that was a Southern thing or an Appalachian thing. So now I get to my questions. I wonder what you would say that Adorno might think of Rancière and how undialectically Rancière proceeds. And if you, I wouldn't ask you to impersonate Adorno or anything, but if you might offer a kind of sketch of what you think Adorno might think of this notion of distribution of the sensible. It's come up a lot for me in the past couple of decades as a problematic point to try and reconcile those two. And then my next question would be, so Hal Foster's term mimetic exacerbation. I like the term. I can hear Foster using it. I can hear him using it around various previously good objects, such as Richard Prince, who are mimetic exacerbators par excellence, but who have been shown to be in ways that we couldn't have noted if we were part of that generation, which I myself wasn't either, that kind of mimetic exacerbation, again in Richard Prince, tends to, if not prefigures and augurs, a kind of serious right libertarianism, a kind of alt-right, if you will, even more so than, in some ways, than Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons. So I'm worried about how Foster's use of that term along the lines of his own critique of his earlier work, his love of Richard Prince, for instance. And then, so that's not really a question, it's more of a comment, and I would welcome any kinds of thoughts you might have on that. And then finally, this materialization of theory. That's a really generous and lovely way to read Claire Fontaine's overall project, especially the bricks, where they take French theory or they take Society of the Spectacle and they wrap the book cover in a brick to suggest a place where theory and praxis might actually meet, say, in an insurrectionary context. And it recalls another source that Claire Fontaine, whether you want to call that entity she or they, cite a lot, which is Guy Debord's oeuvre as a whole, not just Society of the Spectacle. But in Society of the Spectacle, there's the theses that come up a lot as a refrain in art schools, that surrealism sought to realize art without abolishing it, while Dada sought to abolish art without realizing it, and that we need both sides of that kind of dialectic. And you seem to be suggesting that that's what Claire Fontaine does, maybe.
The latter, you mean? Or
the bringing together of the two in this kind of necessary critical totality that Debord was calling for. So those are just some comments and questions that may or may not be able to be contained in the present Q&A. But having thrown all of those out there, I'll leave it to you whether you wish to answer them or take more questions from the collective in the room.
Sure, I'll do a little bit of both. That's cool.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you, Jaleh, so much for those thoughts, because I think they're really useful to me. And I think, okay, to begin with the question about what would Adorno think about Rancière. I mean, I don't, Rancière is completely non-dialectical, right? Self-proclaimingly so. And I think in that way, Adorno probably wouldn't find much use for Rancière in a way. I mean, just the way that I think it's very hard to bring together an understanding of what Rancière is trying to do with a more Marxist perspective anyway, right, or a critical theory perspective. But the reason why I think it's important, or why it might be useful, and you specifically bring up the distribution of the sensible, and I think if there's one concept within Rancière that is useful for critical theory and for a Marxist critique of political economy, it's actually that one, the distribution of the sensible, because I think that doesn't, unlike Rancière's theorization of the political, and a very deliberately ahistorical understanding of the political as like these dissensual moments that kind of surface and that are rare and that don't really have conditions of possibility, don't have economic or class-based conditions of possibility, right? I think the distribution of the sensible is actually more of a aesthetic and perceptual concept that actually is compatible with the Marxism, because I think, in a way, I think, especially with Adorno, if you're trying to think about, this is actually why I was puzzled at Johann Hartl's response to a question that I asked him yesterday, because I think when you think about the whole critique of reification and you think of the tradition of critical theory and how it's approaching critique of political economy, I don't actually think that I think Marxism really does address or try to address issues of consciousness, but I don't think it necessarily addresses issues of perception all that well. I think, yeah, ideology is one way that we can kind of access it, but obviously that's really problematic in a lot of ways, right? And if we then move beyond a certain very traditional Marxist understanding of what ideology is, I think we're still left with questions about how political perception operates and how really we can understand what is at stake in a critique of political economy, and how does subjectivity really transform itself, right? Of course, in relation to the forces of production and the relations of production, but I don't think that it's actually. I don't. That's why when Johann Hartl said that it's just, I'm a Lukashian, and so I don't really need to answer that question. I don't agree with that. I think you actually do have to answer that question. That the perceptual is not an obviously answered for thing in critical theory. And so I think that is why I think that Rancière is useful for that. Because the idea of a distribution of sensible really, really understands that politics is very much about the shifting and the way in which things can appear that were illegible before, and really thinking about the structure of that. And also I think it allows one to get into more affective and somatic questions that are hard to get into, or hard to get just through critical theory itself. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it supplements the problem of ideology with that of perception and somatic experience, and I've tried to offer that in a range of contexts in the past. One criticism that one comes up against in trying to make that point, and also trying to describe or explain the way in which Benjamin's anxiety about the aestheticization of politics has come to pass, right? The right seems to have understood the power of the sensible and the perceptible, while the left remains mired in problems of ideology. So I think Rancière does supplement the classic Benjaminian dialectic. The problem that one comes up against is that it's very difficult to offer this Rancièrean notion of the partition and the sensible along lines of the battle for position, the lines in class war that one must have in order to maintain any kind of position in the neoliberal drift. Yes, I agree on the one hand, but I've come up against this anxiety that it's so dispersed and gentle that it can't be mobilized in a properly political vein. But okay, people are raising their hands.
Okay, can I quickly also say?
Oh.
Quickly, though, I also want to say that the point you made about mimetic exacerbation, point taken for sure, that I think part of the problem of the mimicking is that one can mimic very effectively and too effectively, and then one doesn't really know the difference between, right? I mean, that's essentially what happens,
yes,
right?
There's an essay that I keep foisting on everybody in the last summer's issue of Texte zur Kunst, written by Anna Pinto, in which she argues that the right has understood the lessons of Dada in the ways that the left have not. And that also came to mind in your description of mimetic exacerbation. Now, I think Richard Prince, who I think is an interesting secret alt-right kind of character, and Claire Fontaine are worlds apart. I would not want to collapse those, but that's why I think I'm suggesting that this mimetic exacerbation has to be differentiated from within in order to do the work of differentiating the fascistization of the aestheticization of politics as fascist versus the politicization of aesthetics that is in the service of the left. Philip, and then Samuel.
I'd love to talk about mimetic exacerbation, but I wanted to do the Adorno-Rancière Marxism thing about how they would work, how they would mesh together what's missing. Essentially, I agree with Anita, which is what's occurring in theory is a reflection that in Europe there really is no conception of democracy. There's liberalism, and then there's radicalism or Marxism and so forth. in America, there is within the after Jacobinism, and it gets out of the mainstream. Everything is some version of liberalism versus radicalism against it. In America, there is a discourse about it from the Gettysburg Address and so forth, and it's where people like Sheldon Wolin come out of in political theory. Essentially, what Rancière is doing is trying to add to what you would call worldview Marxism, was something that crystallized about the executive committee of the ruling class and so forth, and bourgeois democracy and so forth. Is Rancière is saying, look, when we talk about the political, we're talking about democracy. If everybody's contribution isn't equal to defining the public space or making decisions, there is no political. There's just obedience. So in that sense, you're trying to reintroduce that back, but also within terms of embodiment and using these notions of resonance rather than the notion that somehow something has to be explained to people who are partway along on something so they could get to this total stage of revolutionary enlightenment, as opposed to this notion of resonance that Christoska has, where, as we see with Black Lives Matter or the gun thing with the people, is things really do spread by resonance. And what we're trying to figure out, I think, is how to expand the spreading without delivering lectures to people who are how to make the resonance wider, I guess, is what we're talking about. And maybe that's where strategies like mimetic exacerbation or others, are things we're trying to look at, these artistic and embodied notions, to see how things happen. That's my sort of attempt to glom it all together. Gramsci, I think, is the only person within the Marxist tradition who tries to develop some sort of conception of democratic space and
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Philip. Shall we take?
We take a few.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got it. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it, and Jaleh, your questions and comments were terrific in terms of also helping to formulate some ideas and thoughts. So just a few things. I mean, I just start with where Jaleh sort of left off yesterday, and then come into a direct sort of engagement with your argument, Anita. Art is not possible under capitalism. I still am struck by that, and the kind of is it a mimetic exacerbation? Is it a sort of willful naivete from people who obviously do know better in terms specifically of Debord? I mean, the whole point is really the abolition and realization of art, not its possibility. We don't want art to continue. Art needs to be negated, but it also needs to be abolished and realized. So I'm not particularly happy with that formulation. I think it's somewhat problematic. Rancière, I think, the distribution of sensible can definitely be brought in, and in fact it's actually there in the critique of political economy. In the very movement into the hidden abode of production, we have a redistribution of the sensible. Now, in a sense, this is the moment of what Badiou would call the event. This is where the worker appears as such, as opposed to simply the owner of labor power, right? So the exchange, the realm of exchange, is now being fundamentally reperceived, as it were. I mean, it's appearing in a way that wasn't possible within strictly the realm of the market. I think that's really quite interesting. I think that's the moment, precisely the Rancièrean moment, as it were, within capital, which he would obviously disavow, but it's there. A case could be made. Mimetic exacerbation doesn't seem to be up to the task of really getting to grips with what we're facing with Trump, which is annihilation, right? It's annihilation of a lot. Why are we so troubled by the word ideology? Because I'm not so sure how we're understanding it. If we have a common understanding, I think the critique of ideology is as actual as it's ever been. Why? What does ideology mean? Well, in one register, ideology means socially necessary illusion. It means the real abstraction of the commodity form. And the last time I looked, we haven't overcome that. Therefore, ideology critique remains actual. do we have a different conception of ideology here? That we can say that it's kind of it's being done, we need to do something else that has to do with affect and so on. I think contained in the idea of ideology critique, the critique of political economy, and we try and argue this in the book, is sinnliche Arbeit, so the sensuous nature of labor as opposed to the labor of the concept of German idealism. It's not just Hegel, but it's also Schelling and especially Fichte, right? So there's that. Just to also, last point about Jaleh, I mean, I agree with your worry about his response, but I think he was also saying that it's in moments of crisis, say when the financial system comes under attack or is undermined, then we perceive it differently. We perceive it as such, right? Heidegger makes a similar kind of argument vis-a-vis the tool. When the tool breaks down, it presents itself as an object to our perception. So the perceptual field shifts, right? And I think that's important. I think it does have to do with perception as well. So
I do too, but can I? Are we going to ask a few more questions, or should I? That's a lot of questions, so I feel like if I'm going to answer any of them. I mean, I do want to speak especially to the point you made about the moments of crisis, relating to what Johann Hartl said, but then also what you were saying earlier about how mimetic exacerbation isn't adequate to what we're facing now, which is annihilation, right? Yeah, and I think that, first of all, the thing about, and it is a moment of crisis then in that sense, right? So what I'm saying, I think, is that, I don't believe that in moments of crisis that there is some kind of, the problem is we're facing political stasis even in the moment of facing annihilation, right? And then how do we understand the role of critique in that moment, in that context, right? So I'm not saying that the perception. I believe that you can definitely use Marx to show that the perceptual field changes, and I think Lukács is useful for that, for thinking through crisis in a way. But that's why I'm talking about the reflection of stasis, because I think that there's something about not really recognizing, right? There's something about an impasse that has to do, I think, with something that I'm trying to describe, outside of this talk, really, as something that happens in the societal nervous system, really, that makes us not register actually the level of possibility of annihilation, right? Because otherwise, in terms of your argument, then we would be doing something, right? Or there wouldn't be this question that we actually are facing, right? Which is that we don't seem to have reflected back to us actually the level of crisis that we actually are in, or that the way that subjectivity is structured in neoliberalism, which I think we're so, in a way, anesthetized by, in a way, the melodrama of politics, and then we're blind just to the daily economic kind of suffering that we face, and then we get distracted from actually annihilation. So I don't think it's self-evident, and then I think that then we need to think about what needs to be reflected back to us in order for us to shift. And so that's what I think. When I talk about mimetic exacerbation, I'm not really using it exactly in the terms that Hal Foster is, because I'm trying to think about it as a sort of alternative form of political perception in moments of crisis. So I don't know if that's clear.
If I could just quickly respond and then move on. I suppose this is really helpful because you're really then zeroing in on something you did mention in the talk, but maybe you didn't foreground it as much, and that's stasis, and then how we understand stasis, right?
Exactly.
Because you could say, yes, there's been a kind of stasis since the moment to realize philosophy was missed, 1917, but maybe not. Maybe there were moments. 68 might have been one of those moments, but also Occupy might have been one of those moments. The Arab Spring, prior to Occupy, might have been one of those moments. The Sanders moment, which followed up on Occupy, might have also been part of the shaking up of the stasis. Corbyn as well. Now, it depends what our in a sense, our critical expectations are. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just piggy writing on the image that the mirror with its crack it's being implemented in this mimetic exacerbation. I wonder if this mechanism could need to have a certain element that includes what is absent, because I'm just coming obviously from a psychoanalytic Lacanian perspective and thinking about how the mirror kind of reifies, concretizes like a static image. And I was thinking when you were talking about the 3D kind of pictures that we have, two pictures that are static, and there's a third that is not included unless you move it. And whether or not that mimetic exacerbation could need a movement in a way of some sort that includes that crack, but to include the negative, what we have been talking yesterday on and on, the residual, the traumatic, that it's being invade. I mean, we are bombarded with the traumatic, but how do we give a space to see it, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a movement needing in the mimetic so to pass this stasis.
Yeah, I think that's such an important fundamental point. And I don't think these works that I showed actually do that very well. I think that one of their works that I think does do that well is this one that they use all the time, really. So it's become kind of a bit of a part of their brand. But it's the matchstick country. Like there's a country wherever they're showing. If it's in the United States, they set up a kind of map that's matchsticks, essentially, in the shape of a map. And I see this as, in a way, it's a provocation, right? Because you have this whole wall that's displayed full of matchsticks, right? And in a sense, there's this kind of this gesture of, well, what do you do with matchsticks, right? I mean, I think that the implication is obviously that you light them on fire, right? And you don't, like, people don't light them on fire. I mean, they started to light them on fire, but no one lights them on fire, obviously. You're just looking at a wall that has matchsticks on it, right? So to me, there's something about a reflection of praxis in there that does reflect the non-existent form of praxis. Do you know what I mean? The form of the obeying of the instinct freedom that actually isn't going to be honored in existing society, because I'm not going to light that thing on fire. I'm just going to look at it. So to me, it's like there's a movement that's actually absent in that, but it's implied. Do you know what I mean? So anyway, I think that's crucial what you said.
But the matchstick map has the potential to explode at any time. I mean, you look at it as well. It could.
Right.
It has. It's burned a gallery down.
Yeah. Not on purpose.
2013,
Yeah.
not on purpose.
In Russia. Right?
No, in San Francisco.
Oh, really? Oh, it happened elsewhere too.
No.
Yeah.
But
That's the insurance. Anyway, two questions, or two thoughts. One is art. You talked about artwork that is a fetish, but it critiques fetishism, and I'm wondering, is that a meta-fetish? Is that art that critique? I'm not sure how that is a commodity, unless it was made to be a commodity. Because it's a fetishism of commodities, and and the question is whether art is all art is commodified in that way, especially art that critiques fetishism. Now, I don't know. I'm not sure what you're exactly referring to, but there could be art. Certainly, there could be art that's produced not for sale or not for exchange, and therefore wouldn't be a commodity.
Yeah.
Although it might be regarded as that. So that's one. And the second thing is that I'm wondering, you mentioned the question of, well, if people saw that we were on 2 minutes away from doomsday, they would act, perhaps. And perhaps we don't have that consciousness. But I think there's more to it. I mean, we may realize that consciously that we're 2 minutes away from doomsday, but we're helpless, and we can't do anything about it because there's no active movement, et cetera, of the people that is rising up, et cetera. So all you can do is sit in your cubicle and, be afraid. So that, to me, that there's more to the art in itself is not going to bring about revolution necessarily, but it could be a component. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, your last point about I think the way that I look at art, and I'm not an art historian, of course, my way of looking at art is really my way of looking at theory. Like I believe that I don't like the separation really between the two, and I think it's rather artificial. And so in a way, yeah, just like theory, art, you can say all the same things, right? That theory isn't going to start a revolution either, right? Except that's not completely true, and I think the same is true of art. It's not, it's about critical consciousness. So I'm not making any wider claims than that, but I'm trying to say that I think that there's a different way that critique could operate, and I'm trying to show how it could access more of our sensate and our affective experience. Because I think, as far as what you said in your first point, I think that's the reason we need to access that with critique. So yeah, I'm not making any tall claims that like these artworks are going to like cause people to go into the streets. I don't I don't think that's what we're doing here. I don't think that's what we're doing in universities exactly. I don't think that's what we're doing when we do critique. I think that we're doing our part in this realm that we live in to try to think through the double binds of neoliberalism. So, and this offers something that I think is not predominant in the way that critique and theory are being deployed.
I think the key term is the materialization of theory, which differentiates Clairefontaine a great deal from the generation of conceptual artists, where your qualification of a kind of meta fetish might be more apropos. But works of art can't technically be the same. They can't be commodities because they're not fungible in the same way. There's a whole structural problem that keeps them from technically operating the way commodities operate, however close they come to being like the commodity. So I think this defetishizing fetish is getting at a certain kind of self-consciousness on the part of their practice that does have to do with trying to push theory into some kind of praxis, which again, the key work is the brick that has been wrapped in French theory, suggesting that, someone can pick it up and throw it through glass. But I want to return, before we take other questions, to some of Samir's questions. Why is there this low-grade diss on ideology critique? Well, there are two ways of coming at that. One, as the kind of former American voting citizen, and one is the art historian. The first position I'll occupy as a voter in the first round of the Obama campaign is that there's a real frustration with a surplus of analysis, again, as I think I put it yesterday, and a total sense of impotence, to use the language that Anita brought up, attributing to Clairefontaine, this kind of surplus of analysis and dearth of agency that I think comes to be associated with ideology critique that ends at critique, right? We can critique and critique and critique, but that doesn't push anything into practice. And I think as an art historian, there's a kind of exhaustion with the work of art functioning as ideology critique, from critique of institutions and conceptual art down to Clairefontaine, who I think strike a break by moving into another arena. So that's how I would answer.
What is that arena? I guess I'm trying to grasp this movement from ideology critique to this other thing that seems to be more efficacious.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about the evidence.
I'm not sure either, which is why I'm probing into Jonathan Crary on the one hand, affect theory, Rancière on the other hand, how our forms of embodiment, resonance, movements within the sensory perceptual register rather than the ideological register, what do they do, if anything? I think that's the question of the present, which is what I see you probing, what your project being about. And then your other question about your feeling troubled by the idea that art is not possible under capitalism, which is Clairefontaine's.
Yeah.
I hear you worrying about agency. That's what I hear as your primary concern with the notion that art isn't possible under capitalism. And I think, again, Clairefontaine are highlighting a generalized sense of agency-lessness into which they're trying to insert tiny interstices of potential, so the matches. But I think that this kind of declaration is really coming from, however much Clairefontaine hate Hegel, piggybacking on Lanzi's let's spin on Hegel, I think they're saying that from a kind of Peter Berger perspective, where art moves when history moves. When there's an impasse in historical agency, there's an impasse in aesthetic capacity. So, as Berger says in Theory of the Avant-Garde, what you have after the Second World War is layer after layer of neo-avant-garde that's just repeating ad infinitum the gestures of the avant-garde, because there is no revolutionary subject, there is no way forward, there is no horizon, da-da-da. So when Badiou says the rebirth of history, or he titles a book that, then suddenly there's this lining to that suggests, well, the rebirth of art and art history because of the entwinement of art and history. So that's my art historical or art historian's answer to why Clairefontaine might say something like art is not possible under capitalism, but it becomes all the more imperative to try. Why? Because the hope is to break capitalism, not to make new art for its own sake. So that's how I tie it.
Yeah, I get that. It's just this worry about the abolition of art itself as a function of the division between manual
Yes.
and intellectual labor, which was really the focus of your argument yesterday. So I'm just trying to get my head around that, actually. And I think really what we're facing is a certain kind of, with the destruction of real forms of negativity within the current moment, it becomes very difficult to imagine some other future, really, in which, say, art doesn't exist any longer. So how is art possible within capitalism? Because that's an infinite horizon. It's Hegel's bad infinity. So, anyway,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, it's kind of partially formed thought, so, but about, to ask you about resonance and its relationship to stasis. And particularly if there are certain kind of objective conditions that need to be met in order for resonance to occur. I mean, that's something acoustically that has to happen. Two objects won't resonate with one another unless they have kind of a closeness or a relationship so that they can cycle at the same rate. A kind of a related concept is in entrainment, where you would take, say, two metronomes that are at different tempos, place them beside one another, and that eventually they'll begin to go at the same tempo. And so in terms of resonance as a response to stasis, what the conditions are that need to happen in order for resonance to occur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really fundamental question. I appreciate that. I mean, at one level, I'm also a sound person too, and but then I'm also like a somatic person. So some of my use of resonance, I think it comes more from the somatic register than just from the sonic. Although I totally hear you, and I think absolutely, I'm a Marxist too. So of course there need to be material conditions in place. But I think when you translate and think about resonance in a somatic register, I think it's the question of, there are certain practices, I think, that highlight and that allow for resonance through entrainment, really, to happen. And when there isn't any happening, because I think that's one of the primary goals of a lot of somatic practice, is to think, okay, there isn't resonance. How does one begin to entrain with another? I mean, and I'm talking about that in a way that's abstracted from a political situation. But I think that what that means then is that there's a certain way, there are certain modes of communication that I think that are invoked in resonance. And I think this gets into why I also have a problem with theory that is overly cognitivist, because I think it doesn't actually allow us to get into those registers. You know what I mean? And I think some of your talk was was touching on that too, that I think that, and maybe that's my problem with ideology critique at one level, is that, and in fact it is, that I believe that it stays on a more cognitivist register. And so it doesn't actually allow us to access some of the conditions of possibility, and really not conditions of possibility, but capacities really for entrainment or for resonance. I think resonance is a difficult concept for a lot of reasons too, because, there's some political theorists who've been writing about resonance, like William Connolly, for example, who want to also talk about resonance as something that happens, on the right very easily. Like they talk about the capitalist resonance machine, and so I don't want to say that resonance is somehow always also good, I don't think it's a normative concept in that way, but I do think that what I'm trying to do, and I haven't done it in this talk, but thinking about more in terms of the problematics of embodiment that I've been thinking about, that there's a way that I'm trying to theorize something like a societal nervous system that really, when we think about moments of stasis, that there's a way of thinking about freeze in a nervous system, and so some of these concepts are coming through as a way of thinking through, what do you do? You have to meet the system in a certain way. You have to meet the freeze in a nervous system. And so that's what I would say about that. But thanks, really important question. Thanks.
I'm trying to relate this to my own experience of politics and what I see happening politically. In 1968, you could believe that there was a socialist alternative. And so rather trivial things like the complaints about visiting between the sexes in the dorms at Nanterre could somehow bubble over and explode into a socialist movement. I read once that the 1905 revolution in Russia was started by a strike of typographers who wanted to be paid equally for punctuation and letters. So anything can be the spark, right? This is Benjamin's messianic moment, right? The idea that there's this explosive potential in society, that it's not evoked by ideology or ideology critique or by theory or by art. It's evoked by particular injustices or instances that mobilize people, and then they, to use the expression we've been using, they resonate, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Occupy, whatever. What's missing since '68 is any credible belief in an alternative. So this seems to me the key issue. The not so much problems with ideology critique or with art, or it's that lack of a utopian consciousness that I don't know how you make that happen again. I wish I did, but I just, it seems to me that's why there's this stasis that you talk about. Mm-hmm. The stasis is the result of, there are movements, there's no doubt that there are people who are complaining and dissatisfied, but it can't explode because there's no sense of an alternative future.
There are movements, but no alternatives.
Right.
This is why I love your phrase atomistic tempo.
Yeah.
This strikes me as, the underlying conditions that make the kind of spark that would have the capacity to really do something is rendered impossible in advance by, in your terms, neoliberalism's atomistic tempo. That seems to be the central nervous system's current pathological condition that makes the messianic spark, it just snuffs out on right there and then. Not to be pessimistic.
Right, no, that's helpful. And yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but then, and I think that's actually what Claire Fontaine's art is about in a way, about exactly what you're saying, that it's like the unthinkability of an alternative, right? And, with the whole capitalism kills love, but my love still doesn't die, right? It's like, capitalism kills love. We still have this impulse to love. We still have an impulse to change things, but the spark doesn't catch on. And so what do you do in that impasse? You know, what do you, and I think that in a way, I mean, I don't know how people feel about the idea of the impasse, but I actually kind of like it. Lauren Berlant's idea of, you know, the really perceptual disorientation that occurs in what I would call an impasse, which is what you described, I think, right? That no ability to have any kind of overarching political alternative vision that would provide an orientation. And that orientation would literally be also a perceptual one as well as a normative or praxis-oriented one, you know? And so then what do you do, right? It's like you make art in the meanwhile, you do critique in the meanwhile, but while flagging the very impossibility. And so that's why I think that gesture is a useful one. But that's all I can say is that I think that marking that is the best that can be done, you know, and then mirroring it back so that there is a change, you know, because through that entrainment, through that resonance of the shock back to one, I think that things can start to dislodge maybe.
On one of the more minor points on Fitzgerald's quote on intelligence, on that, like on the aspect of the art of storytelling, and like if an individual like understands like the two options in a political situation and chooses political like stasis, would that be like a lack of development or like a hindrance to the storytelling aspect?
I mean, wait, what exactly do you mean by the storytelling aspect?
Sorry, so like the storytelling is like trying to make a point, like the point of art to kickstart like political movement.
Yeah. You know, no, I mean, my intention isn't to like, I think in these moments of stasis, like that's more typical than anything else, right? What you just described. And I don't think it's about, I think part of the old Marxist problematic around this is to make some argument about false consciousness or something like that, right? Which is kind of what you described, I think, though they're not developed enough or whatnot. And no, that's not my feeling at all. And I don't even think that's the reason, you know. I think it's much more about, I don't think it's about a lack of development. I think it's about a lack of being able to really sense what's happening and to have a kind of sense also of the totality. I mean, I think what came through in some of the papers earlier today about neoliberalism and the way that it, you know, impacts even our aspirations towards, you know, I'm thinking of the presentation on the novelist, you know, that, yeah, about, so how neoliberalism kind of structures our very ways of having enjoyment even, or and funnels all of our desires towards, you know, economic ends and entrepreneurial ends. So to me, no, I totally take your point, and I think that's why we don't want to be talking about false consciousness.
Are there any more questions or comments? Yeah.
All right, I'll ask a quick question. I heard that there's a theory that one of the best ways to destabilize like a system is to overly agree with it. So regarding like these examples, that it overly agrees and it goes back, so it goes back and forth, like on and off. And this reflection, is this like, could you say reflection is sort of like to agree, and then regarding the overly agreeing thing, like resonance cascade? So, you know, lighting the wall on fire, yeah, like it's made of matches, but to overly agree with it obviously destabilizes the structure. You shouldn't cross the line to light it on fire, even though it's potential, but...
Well, but I think in that case, the idea is that I think the artists would like if somebody lit it on fire. I mean, at some level, right? I think it's a provocation.
Yes.
So it's not about not crossing the line. The idea is it's about showing where the line is.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Showing how there are all these conditions within capitalism that mean that we would never burn private property, right? We would never go up to an artwork and burn it. We would never, we would be liable for all kinds of things if we did that, right? But the gesture of lighting on fire would be the instinct, I think, and that's what it's highlighting, the way in which, so what's being mirrored back to you is your repression of your own instinct, ultimately, the political instinct towards freedom in that artwork, I think. And so I don't think it's about agreeing or overly agreeing. That's why I think it's about reflection. It's like, it's like, and the reflection shows the stasis and then allows for another thing to happen. So in that case, it's about, praxis.
So acceptance wouldn't be a better word rather than agreeing? Or, okay, just reflection just as is, as best you can, like as unideologically charged, or?
I think it's not about acceptance, because I don't think there's I don't think there's as much like a normative or even cognitive dimension to it. I mean, there is a cognitive dimension to it too, but it's not separated from just being able to literally recognize that that is your assumption living in capitalist society, that you feel that way about private property, or that you feel that way about political practice. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's bigger than. It's not about acceptance. It's about not revealing, but it's kind of about it's reflecting back to you what you do and you're unconscious of.
You sense yourself sensing.
Right.
It's
right.
the Kantian moment in Adorno that you were channeling. But
I like that. Yeah.
Just a quick response to your comment. Wouldn't that be the basis for, say, accelerationism? Maybe, I don't know, Samir has more to say about that. But
Say about acceleration. Other than Nick Land. That's the telos of acceleration.
I guess just following up on what we discussed earlier about utopianism, there were some Marxist theorists who tried to elaborate utopian conceptions. I'm thinking of Bloch and Marcuse.
Yeah.
And they are completely out of fashion.
I love Marcuse.
yeah, Marcuse.
We had a paper about Bloch.
Marcuse is in fashion, I assure you.
He's
I'm
coming
glad.
back.
I'm glad
Yeah.
he's coming back. But I'm wondering, I mean, what is the promise of this kind of explicit reflection on utopian alternatives in a moment of extreme stasis? Is this what we need, maybe, is more explicit discussion? I mean, Adorno is wonderful, but he says the good thing is known through the bad thing. He's not going to tell you anything about utopia.
Yeah.
He's just going to tell you that he's going to help you see what shit you're surrounded by.
Yeah.
That's basically all he's going to do for you. Whereas Marcuse and Bloch tried to go beyond that, and I don't know, maybe this is more what we need now.
I mean, I think, but even in Marcuse, isn't there there's that moment of, I'm thinking of Eros and Civilization, and really thinking about the dialectic between Eros and Thanatos, and ultimately I think he thinks that there's some, the drive towards Thanatos is getting so strengthened in a way by the reduction of Eros in labor, which I think is a really important argument for what's going on today, for sure. But then I think that isn't there a moment though in Marcuse where it's like that needs to lead somewhere, right? Otherwise we're really just there's a version of an Adornian moment there with him, right? So it's like where does the utopia emerge? I don't think Marcuse is actually as utopian as he's portrayed as somehow. I don't know.
And just very briefly, this might be the tiny interstice whereby Clairefontaine exceed Adorno's I'll show you the good through the bad, because there's another dimension to their work that is maybe not so much a Marxist dimension as an anarchist dimension, which is to not only reflect to you your impotence, but to suggest ways that you might locate your agency. So there's always this sly way of giving the art student lesson plans in daily survivance, for example, making tools for pickpocketing, or the word play on redemption, where what is meant by redemption there isn't transcendental experience, but learning to smelt your own cans so that you can convert them into another kind of energy. And this is a collective that's also connected to any number of quasi-utopian communes in Europe, like Tarnac, where, there is a way in which everything comes together when everything falls apart. And I'm thefting the title of a recent film on Tarnac, where when the conditions are so bad, you have little pockets of mutual aid and forms of survivance. So I just want to throw that out there as, that the kinds of emergent utopias might not be along the lines of Bloch or Marcuse or Adorno, but just, the basics of learning to live off the grid for 72 whole hours, that finding your agency within that, those forms of being.
Yeah, well, I think this has been a really fascinating panel, and I think what's been one of the best things about it has been this kind of ongoing, sustained conversation as well, rather than just individual questions that go back and forth. I think that there's something still to be said about ideology critique in terms of what you describe in the dorm, in the typesetters who are protesting, which spirals into a revolution. Black Lives Matter. Well, there's an imminent critique of the non-realization of a certain kind of normative order, right? Black lives ought to matter. They don't. That's why we're protesting. It's not just about the sensate. It's about the relationship between resonance and these larger normative claims within which our social lives are organized, right? And this is a kind of practical imminent critique, saying this is not being lived up to. Not only should it be lived up to, but it should be exceeded in a different order. So I think we really are in trouble if we just say, oh, no more ideology critique.
Well, no, and I'm not saying that.
No, I know you're not saying that.
Don't quote me on that.
I think there is a certain kind of move afoot in that direction. So anyway, I think this has been a really terrific couple of days. I want to thank very much our current panelists. Anita, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Thank you, Jaleh. As I was alluding to a second ago, thank you so much for your participation as an audience, both in this panel, but over the last 48 hours. I'd like to thank everybody who presented and chaired and attended over these last couple of days. Again, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors here, SFU Public Square, Labor Studies at SFU, and the Van City office for community engagement. Huyen's taken off, but I'd like to obviously thank her for all the work that she's done for this event, but all the work she does in general. It's amazing. It goes well beyond what's professionally required of her. And I think that given that an important dimension of I think all the talks were those forms of labor that are, in a sense, outside of what is remunerated wage labor. I think we have to acknowledge that. That goes without saying. But then all the work that's done. Hey, it's the machinery of surplus value. It's not got anything to do with me.
It's not personal, it's structural.
We've all read Marx. We know this. Okay, so
let's thank Samir.
Oh, thank you.
If you can't stay for all of dinner, hopefully.